In this video, we look at how to replace a motor in a Quadrone iSight drone. So in this case, one of the motors, this one right here, doesn't seem to work anymore. So we're going to go through the process of taking everything apart and seeing about replacing that motor. So we'll start by removing the rotor, simple screw at the top. If you are going to take off more than one rotor, just be careful because the rotors are different. So just make sure that you know which one goes where. I'm going to line up all the pieces here in order so that it makes it easy to put it back together. I'll next remove the rotor guard. So again, it's a single screw. Now the rotor guard does have two pegs that go into holes, so just be gentle when you're taking it out. You do have to lift it out carefully. So once the screw's removed, you might have to wiggle from either side to be able to pop that out. You don't want to break the peg off in the hole. So again, just a little bit of back and forth should do it, and then off it comes. Once those two parts are off, the motor is actually in this little housing here, so we need to get at that. If we flip the drone upside down, we'll see that there are some screws located around here, and also some screws along the arms and the rest of the body there. We'll start by taking some of the screws out for the cover. Again, just lining up the screws in order. There are a couple of different size screws, so just be careful of that. Next, we can take off the camera. It just kind of slides out. Disconnect the connector as well. And then we can disconnect the battery and remove it. If you look carefully, you can see that there are a lot of screws in here. So we'll just start taking them apart little by little. And again, trying to keep them in order so that we don't lose them, but also are able to put them back in the correct order. Once all the screws are out, you should be able to just gently pull the top and bottom pieces apart. Before we do that though, we do need to remove the landing gear. I almost forgot about that. There are a couple of screws also right by the switch, so we should remove those as well. The two of them, they're kind of in deep. I think they're quite long. So we'll just pull those out. Oh, sorry, those are the short ones. And then there are 4 screws, again, holding down the cover. It's well fastened. So here's where we can just, all the screws are out now. So again, it's just a matter of squeezing a little bit, pulling a little bit. Don't try to go at this too hard. You don't need a lot of force. It's more technique than anything else. So I'm just squeezing the pieces a little bit and then pulling a little bit, and sure enough, off it comes. Again, we'll set the cover aside. We're going to want to get at the other side, so we'll flip it over. Again, here's the motor that we're trying to replace. You can see here all of the innards. Just going to connect the battery again. One of the things that it appears to be the motor that's the issue, but just to double check, what we'll do is we'll connect the battery, and once the battery's connected, we'll give a little bit of power, and just to make sure, we'll measure the voltage across the 2 contacts on that board to make sure that there is in fact power there, just to make sure that it's not a problem on the circuit board. No sense replacing the motor if that's not the issue. So we're going to turn the voltmeter to 20 volts and just touch the 2 contacts that the motor are soldered to, and when you do that, we can see that we do get in fact some current. There we go, we saw a little over 3 volts. There we go, 3.5 volts coming through. So there is power there, which means that the problem is somewhere between the contacts and the motor, most likely the motor. So we'll go ahead and remove that cover. We should probably turn the drone off We're going to work with the circuitry. Maybe remove the battery as well, just so that it's not in our way. We'll pop that cover off. Again, it's not a something that needs a lot of force, just more technique, pushing the two ends together, or the two sides together, and eventually the cover will pop off. You don't want to push too hard or you might break something. So in here we can see there's the motor. I did purchase a new motor. I'll link to the site where I got that so that you can see. When I did purchase the motor, I noticed on the website that there were actually two different kinds of motors that you could purchase for the same drone. And as I look at the drone, I could see that there's a motor with a red and blue leads, and a different motor, some different motors with black and white. So I just got the same colored leads to replace. Now, I originally had intended to replace the motor right to the board, but if I look carefully, I noticed that the two contacts were very close together. My soldering is not good enough to be able to solder that without any problem. So I figured I'd cut the wires a little further back and solder the wires back so that I wasn't ruining the board with my poor soldering techniques. So we'll go ahead and cut the wires. I'm not going to cut the red and the blue in the same location, just in case the covering comes off and the wires start to rub together. I don't want them to cause a short, so I'm actually going to cut them different lengths. Once the wires are cut, we can go ahead and strip a little bit of the wire off. You'll notice that the motor wires are threaded through the motor assembly. So I just took the motor out and threaded the new one in exactly the same way that the old one went in. So thread the wires through, make sure that the motor fits in its spot, makes contact with the gear at the bottom, which it seems to. And here are the two wires. Hard to see, but we're just going to strip a little more off. The wires did come stripped at the end, but we're going to strip off a little bit more so we can get a good connection when we go to solder that together. Wires are small and take a little bit of fiddling. So we stripped the wires on the motor first, then did the same thing on the drone. Try not to cut the wire too close to the drone, otherwise this part becomes a little bit tough. Of course, the wire strippers I had were extra large, so it didn't help any. I also cut a little bit of a piece of heat shrink tubing that I put on each of the wires for the motor, and we'll just use that heat shrink to cover up the connection afterwards so there's no accidental contact. Of course, you could use electrical tape as well, but heat shrink I thought would be a nice touch. So twisting the wires together, and then we'll go ahead, put heat shrink tubing on the other wire, twisting the wires together. And then we're all set for some solder. Be careful with the soldering iron. Obviously, the drone itself is made out of plastic. You don't want to touch it by accident, and you don't want to touch any of the other wires that are located inside by accident as well. A little bit of solder on each of those connections. Make sure the connection is good. You don't want to have to take this all apart and come back. Once the solder was done, then I just pulled the heat shrink tubing over the connection, just melted the heat shrink tubing so that we had a nice clean connection there. Once that was done, we could put the motor in place and just carefully tuck all the wires back in. Before we do that, though, we should just make sure that this works. There's no sense putting everything back together only to find out that something didn't quite work. So again, plug in the battery, turn on the power, fire up the remote, give it a little bit of throttle, and you can see here that the motor's spinning. I noticed that my motor didn't seem to be spinning as quickly as I thought it should, and it certainly stopped pretty quickly. It turned out there was a small piece of debris in there, a little piece of, I don't know, pine needle or something. So it came out, and that's probably what caused the motor to burn out in the first place. So now we can put the motor back into the back onto the drone itself, and then just tuck the wires away. Again, you don't want to pinch the wires once you assemble the cover, so just make sure that they're well out of the way. When you go to attach the motor in the assembly, there's a little pin and hole there, so just make sure that you find those, match them up, and everything should fit nicely. Again, we'll turn off the power, tuck in the wires, put the cover back on, it might take a little bit of fiddling, as it did here, just to kind of get everything nice and snug. It turns out that I didn't get perfectly snug, but the screws will do that in the end. Again, same thing with the cover. Once you're ready, I lined it up the same way that I took it off. I made note and knew that I can, when I was reading the cover, it was the top left corner. And then it was just a matter of reassembling all the little bits and pieces. So the 4 screws in on the bottom, and then the screws along the arms and everything else. So pretty straightforward from here on in. The video just kind of from here just shows how to reassemble, but again, it's just a matter of working backwards. After the 4 screws in the corners, went to the 2 screws at the switch, and then from there moved on to the screws at the outer edges of the arms on the drone. Just putting them back in. Try not to force anything, and you certainly don't want to over tighten. If you over tighten the screws, you could strip them, and then there's nothing to hold the bits and pieces back together. So once the screws mostly back in, you're able to put the rotor guard back on the rotor itself, and then just about done, not much left. A few screws left on the bottom just for that motor cover. And then we can put everything else back on. So the landing gear goes back on. The camera, battery, and then of course we can test it out to make sure that it still works. And sure enough, there it is. So certainly looking forward to some flying of our drone again, and getting it back into action so we can get some good video. So again, here it is, testing it out just to make sure we're back in business. Thanks for watching.